Toxic Commando is a first-person shooter focused on co-op, where you and up to 3 friends face absurd hordes of toxic mutants in an environment that mixes total chaos with that B-movie vibe Carpenter loves. On the surface, it seems simple. Just another horde shooter, kill everything that moves, hold the line. But when you start digging a little deeper, you begin to realize there's a lot of interesting stuff behind this game that went unnoticed. So today, I put together 10 trivia facts about Toxic Commando that you might not know. I'm Matthew, and let's get started. If you played Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 and your jaw dropped at those absurd hordes of Tyranids coming from all sides, you need to pay attention to this piece of info because it significantly changes your perspective on Toxic Commando. The game uses exactly the same graphics engine, Saber Interactive Swarm engine, the same technology responsible for rendering hundreds of simultaneous enemies on screen without making the game implode. It's no coincidence, it's a very intentional choice. The Swarm engine was built with a specific purpose in mind, making hordes look like actual hordes. You've probably noticed in World War Z how those crowds of zombies move like a single organism without it looking like the engine is just pasting identical sprites next to each other. That's exactly the kind of feeling Toxic Commando wants to bring to the setting of mutant zombies and John Carpenter creatures. And speaking of John Carpenter, this matters a lot more than it seems. The director's horror aesthetic, that feeling of being completely surrounded with no way out, relies directly on having enough enemies to create real pressure. With an engine that couldn't handle hundreds of entities at the same time, the game would be just another generic shooter with a famous name slapped on the cover. The technology here directly serves the creative vision. So when you're playing and realize there are zombies everywhere, that there's nowhere to run, and the screen is literally full of creatures, know that this isn't a design accident, it's calculated engineering. The same engineering that made Space Marine 2 one of the biggest hits of 2024 is now working to make you panic in a completely different setting. It's fascinating to see how a technology migrates from a military sci-fi universe to 80s B-movie horror and still makes perfect sense. After learning that vehicles in Toxic Commando aren't safe havens and that the infected will pull you out while moving, you could easily conclude that cars are more of a problem than a solution. But then the game does the exact opposite of what you'd expect and turns those same vehicles into some of the most creative and fun tools you'll find in a recent co-op game. The range of what's available is absurd in the best possible way. There's a vehicle that works as a giant decoy, attracts an entire horde, and explodes in the middle of them. A bomb with an engine and 4 tires. There's another that gives you infinite ammo while you're inside it, which in a game built around constant waves of creatures is practically borderline cheating. And there's an ambulance that heals the entire team around it. Each car is essentially a character class on wheels, and choosing which one to take on a mission becomes a real tactical decision. What ties all this together in a way that impressed me was the ability to form a convoy with multiple vehicles at the same time. This means your team can combine all these abilities simultaneously on the move. An ambulance healing everyone, a car baiting and exploding the horde, another providing covering fire with infinite ammo, all while plowing through mud with infected climbing on top. It's not just chaos, it's chaos with intent. This design layer reveals that Saber Interactive thought of vehicles as a complete system, not just transport with a few tacked on bonuses. The convoy is the ultimate expression of this, the moment when everything clicks and that crazy idea of mixing SnowRunner with a zombie apocalypse suddenly makes all the sense in the world. When a famous name appears in a game's title, the question everyone asks is the same. Was he actually involved, or did he just sign a check? In the case of John Carpenter's Toxic Commando, the answer is very clear, and honestly, it pleasantly surprised me. Carpenter didn't just lend his name, he helped write the story, composed the synth soundtrack alongside Fractal Edge music, and even voiced a character in the official animated trailer. That's genuine involvement. The soundtrack part makes total sense when you think about his career. Carpenter has been a composer for decades. He created some of the most iconic horror music in cinema history, that Halloween theme that everyone knows even if they haven't seen the movie. Synth and horror go hand in hand in his identity, so bringing that to the game doesn't feel forced. It feels natural. When you're blasting creatures in a horde and that music is pumping, you feel like it was made for this exact moment. But what really made me laugh was the animated trailer part. Carpenter appears voicing a character described as a zombie party god, with music by the band Gunship playing in the background. That's such a specific, weird, and fun choice that it could only have come from someone who was genuinely having fun with the project, not someone just fulfilling a contract. There's something very refreshing about seeing a 78-year-old filmmaker totally willing to show up in a chaotic trailer as a partying zombie god with no apparent embarrassment. This is Carpenter being Carpenter, someone who has never taken himself too seriously, but has always taken the work seriously. And that specific combination is exactly what makes his presence here feel legitimate rather than just decorative. If someone told you that the most interesting zombie survival game in recent times is basically Left 4 Dead mixed with SnowRunner, you'd probably think they were exaggerating. But John Carpenter's Toxic Commando does exactly that. And the detail that changes everything is how the vehicles work. You drive off-road, manage mud, fuel, the winch, and repairs like in a real simulator, only with a horde trying to rip you out of the driver's seat. And when I say rip, I mean literally. The infected don't just stand around waiting for you to pass. They climb onto the vehicle while it's moving, break the windows, and pull you out. That sense of safety every zombie game gives you when you get into a car simply doesn't exist here. The vehicle is a tool, not a safe haven, and the game makes a point of making that clear in the most brutal way possible. This completely changes the dynamic of how you think about mobility. In Left 4 Dead, a car was basically untouchable. In any open world zombie game, you get in a car and breathe a sigh of relief. Toxic Commando eliminates that relief. Now you have to manage the terrain, the fuel, the vehicle's mechanics, and the monsters climbing all over you at the same time. The pressure is constant and comes from all sides. What impresses me most about this design choice is that it's honest with the player. The game doesn't pretend to be a power fantasy where you run over everything without consequences. It wants you to feel the weight of every decision, including the one to get into a vehicle. And in a real apocalypse scenario, it makes perfect sense that a noisy engine is exactly the kind of thing that attracts unwanted attention. Sometimes the mud will save you more than the gas pedal. Few things excite me more in a game universe than when creators decide to expand the lore outside the main medium in a way that feels genuine, not just cheap merchandise thrown onto the market to ride the hype. John Carpenter's Toxic Commando: Rise of the Sludge God, published by Dark Horse Comics in 22/4, is exactly that case. An official prequel comic that tells the origin of the Sludge God even before the game reached players' hands, building the villain with care and intention. The choice of Dark Horse makes total sense when you consider the publisher's track record. They have a long tradition of working with sci-fi and horror properties. Universes like Aliens, Predator, and Hellboy have passed through their hands. Putting the Toxic Commando universe in this context gives the comic immediate credibility and places the Sludge God in a lineage of antagonists that Dark Horse knows very well how to present with real weight and personality. What makes this comic especially interesting is the timing. It dropped in 22 years before the game launched in March 22/6. This means the Sludge God's origin story was already available for anyone wanting to dive into the universe ahead of time. When you finally meet this character in the game, you're not meeting him from scratch. You come in with context, with built-up history, and that completely changes your emotional relationship with the antagonist. Carpenter has always understood that the best monsters need an origin, not necessarily explained within the main work, but existing somewhere. Rise of the Sludge God seems to follow this exact philosophy, expanding the universe for those who want more depth, without forcing anyone to read the comic to enjoy the game. It's lore built smartly, the way it should be done. One of the things that caught my attention the most in everything involving John Carpenter's Toxic Commando wasn't even the gameplay itself, but a quote from John Carpenter himself in interviews. While the development team insists on calling the creatures infected, Carpenter himself simply couldn't care less. To him, these things are ghouls, or in the most direct and honest definition he could give, monsters that blow up real good. And look, that says a lot about who John Carpenter is. This is the same guy who directed The Thing and Halloween, and who was never a big fan of over-explaining the horror he creates. There's a tradition in modern horror cinema of trying to scientifically justify everything, giving a rational origin to every monster, calling them infected because it sounds more credible than zombie. Carpenter clearly has no patience for that kind of sanitized narrative. What's funny is that this tension between the studio and the director ends up being, in practice, a small reflection of two different philosophies. The studio wants to build a universe with rules, with lore, with its own terminology. Carpenter wants things to explode in your face so you can have fun. Both approaches have value, but it's hard not to smile when you imagine him watching someone blast one of these creatures and simply saying, "See?" Blows up real good. Ultimately, regardless of what you call these creatures while playing, whether infected, ghoul, or simply that horrible thing that almost killed me, the game's energy carries that Carpenter trademark. Chaos, brutality, and a very dry sense of humor that makes everything feel exactly as ridiculous and fun as it should be. Some of the best ideas in gaming history were born from completely mundane moments, and John Carpenter's Toxic Commando is a perfect example of this. The game's concept didn't come from a formal design meeting, it didn't come from market analysis. It came from Saber Interactive's CEO watching a streamer stuck in the mud in SnowRunner, and having a thought as simple as it was brilliant. What if there were zombies here? Think about it for a second. SnowRunner and MudRunner are games about patience, about pulling a stuck truck out of the mud inch by inch, about feeling the weight and resistance of the terrain. It's almost meditative. Now throw a horde of creatures trying to devour you into the middle of all that. That calm tension of the simulator turns into instant panic. It's a contrast so absurd that it could only either work perfectly or sink completely, and apparently the team bet it would work. What I like about this origin story is that it reveals something about how creativity actually works. Nobody was trying to invent a new genre. The CEO was simply watching a guy suffering in the mud in a trucking game, and his mind went to a completely different place. This kind of unexpected connection between things that have nothing to do with each other is exactly what generates concepts you've never seen before. And in the context of a game with John Carpenter's name on the cover, it makes total sense. Carpenter has always been a director who mixed genres without asking for permission. Sci-fi with horror, Westerns with action, suspense with dark comedy. So having a game with mud simulator DNA mixed with a zombie apocalypse is, in a way, the exact right spirit to carry that name. Full crossplay at launch is still one of those things that seems obvious on paper, but in practice, few games actually deliver on day one. John Carpenter's Toxic Commando arrived on March 12th, 2026, with full support across PC via Steam, PC via Epic Games Store, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series X and S. No restrictions, no waiting for a future update. No coming soon that we've learned to distrust. This matters a lot more than it seems when you consider the type of game Toxic Commando is. It was built around co-op, playing with other people, surviving the chaos together. When a game like this fragments its player base by platform, it creates a serious problem. Your friend has a PS5, you have a PC, and suddenly you can't play together unless one of you buys the game on a different platform. That kind of barrier kills entire communities before they even have a chance to grow. What Saber Interactive did here was bet on the community as a whole, rather than relying on each platform to build its own bubble. And that's a decision that truly respects the player. You choose where to play based on your preferences, your hardware, your library, not because you're forced to be on an island separated from everyone else. In today's multiplayer gaming landscape, where keeping an active player base is a constant challenge, launching with full crossplay is almost an act of responsibility. It means that when you boot up the game weeks or months after launch, the matchmaking queues still have people, there's still someone to play with. And in a game about surviving a horde of creatures that blow up real good, playing alone is definitely not the ideal experience. One of the things that subverts expectations the most in Toxic Commando is discovering that missions don't work like that linear corridor most co-op horde shooters put you in. You don't have a fixed path. There's no mandatory order for objectives. The game opens the map in front of you and lets you and your team decide how you want to approach the situation. This choice completely changes the pace of every session. And it's not just the objective order that varies. Vehicle and item spawns change every time you play, which means that perfect strategy that worked in the last session might not be available the same way in the next one. You have to adapt to what the map gives you, not the other way around. This adds a layer of unpredictability that keeps the game fresh even after many hours, because no session is identical to the last. The ability to split the team opens up this range even further. While 2 players handle one objective, the other 2 can be exploring another corner of the map, looking for resources or vehicles. This freedom to divide and conquer is the kind of thing that turns a standard co-op session into something that feels organic, where group decisions matter and each player has real agency over what's happening. And all of this fits into 15 to 40-minute sessions, which is a tough balance to strike, but Saber apparently pulled it off. It's enough time to get invested in the mission, make real tactical decisions, and feel like you accomplished something significant, but without requiring you to block off an entire afternoon on your calendar to play. In a world where free time is increasingly scarce, that's no small detail. If there's one thing that sets Toxic Commando apart from most zombie survival games released in recent years, it's the tone. This game doesn't want to be serious. It doesn't want to make you feel the existential weight of the apocalypse or drop you into a bleak narrative about the human condition. It wants you to laugh while decapitating a creature with a katana as someone on your team cracks a sarcastic comment about the situation. It's 100% 80s Carpenter, and that is a massive compliment. The references pop up everywhere for those familiar with his work. The energy of Escape from New York is in the character's DNA, that I don't care about anything, but I'm going to fix this anyway attitude. The Thing shows up in the dread of creatures that mutate and catch you off guard. They Live is present in that layer of twisted political humor Carpenter has always liked embedding in his stories. You don't need to know any of these movies to enjoy the game, but when you catch a reference, you can't help but smile. What really hooked me was learning that the characters know they're in a horror movie and actively make fun of it. This kind of meta humor is hard to nail because it can easily become forced and exhausting. But when it's well calibrated, as it seems to be here, it builds a camaraderie with the player that few games achieve. You're not just playing, you're sharing an inside joke with the characters themselves about the absurdity of the situation. And deep down, that's exactly what an 80s buddy movie did best. The best films from that era weren't afraid to be ridiculous because they trusted the character's charm and the energy of what was happening on screen. Toxic Commando seems to have understood this completely. Katanas, explosions, sarcastic dialogue, and winking references to the audience, all together, all loud, without apologizing for any of it. Exactly the way Carpenter always liked to do it.